Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Emmett Collins. I'm the chair of IPAC Manitoba. Welcome to today's webinar on public health in the age of fake news. This is an event that IPAC Manitoba has had sort of kicking around in the back of our heads for over a year now. And we've sort of tried to take it on from different angles, and all of this was going on even before COVID-19 was even a thing people were aware of. But the last several months have really put the topic in sharp relief and demonstrated that it is not only still relevant, it's more relevant than ever. So I'm very pleased today that we're able to have two professors of journalism from Carleton University to talk about their research on disinformation and COVID-19. But before we go any further, I would like to do the land acknowledgement. So IPAC Manitoba is based out of Winnipeg, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Just a bit of housekeeping. This presentation will be recorded and posted on YouTube at a later date. Generally, it's been within a couple of days, which also has the advantage of providing subtitles to our videos. The presenter view can be changed. So if you are currently seeing a whole bunch of boxes, on the upper right-hand side, you should be able to toggle between gallery view and speaker view. And speaker view will just be, as the name suggests, the person who's speaking. Everyone will be muted except for the presenters. And so we ask that all questions be put in the chat. We will be taking questions at the end, but we will take them through chat and then I will read them to the speakers at the end. So we have two speakers today. We'll go in order, but I'll give you a brief bio before they start speaking. Sarah Everts is an associate professor and CTV chair in digital science journalism at the School of Journalism and Communication at Carleton University. She joined Carleton in 2019 after more than a decade in Berlin, where she reported on science and technology for a variety of publications, including Scientific American, New Scientist, Smithsonian, Chemical and Engineering News, and others. Her work has garnered several awards and accolades, such as inclusion in the 2017 Best American Science and Nature Writing Anthology. She recently co-authored an article for the Institute for Research on Public Policy that explores public trust and misinformation surrounding COVID-19 in Canada. Chris Dornan is an associate professor with the School of Journalism and Communication at Carleton University. He previously served for 9 years as director of the School of Journalism and 6 years as director of the Arthur Kroger College of Public Affairs. He's worked as a reporter for the Edmonton Journal, an editor and editorial writer for the Ottawa Citizen, and a columnist for the Globe and Mail and CBC National Radio. In 2016, he was the Erasmus Mundus Visiting Scholar at the Danish School of Journalism at the University of Aarhus. Among other venues, his academic work has appeared in Critical Studies in Communication, the Media Studies Journal, the Canadian Medical Association Journal, Topia, Journalism Studies, and the research reports of the Royal Commission on Electoral Reform and Party Financing. In June 2020, he published a paper for the Public Policy Forum, which explores the spread of disinformation on social media about COVID-19 and science skepticism more generally. So without any further ado, I will pass the floor to Sarah.
Hi, hello everybody. Good afternoon if you're in Eastern Standard Time. Good morning, I guess, if you're elsewhere. And of course, don't want to neglect Atlantic Canada either. To address the elephant in the room, I am not in a sauna. I am on my balcony porch. COVID-19 has caused us all to come up with alternative solutions to our workspaces, and this is mine. I am just about to share my screen so that I can show you some slides. So let's start here. Can everybody see my slides? A little nod from somebody would be, thank you, Chris. So as I woke up this morning and read the news, I found it fascinating that this was at least on the top of mind. An opinion piece by the Globe and Mail about COVID-19's death toll. And the fact that it came from the Globe and Mail, and the fact that they needed to note that no, that's not fake news, left so much to unpack, and I think was very pertinent to the situation that we're going to be discussing today. So I'm having a little bit of problems actually moving my slides forward. So allow me to do one last attempt. There we go. Okay. So what I'm going to start off by sharing with everybody is some work that I've been doing in collaboration with some others at Carleton School of Journalism and Communication, namely Brett Popplewell, Josh Greenberg, and Chris Waddell. And in May, as the pandemic was descending on all of us, we decided to take the pulse of Canadians on a wide variety of issues. How they were feeling about COVID-19, were they afraid, nervous, optimistic? Where were they getting their news? Who did they trust for news? And also whether any of the misinformation and pseudoscience that had been circulating on social media and the web had taken root in the minds of Canadians. And so we did 3 installments, or we're planning 3 installments of this poll. There was one in May, we did a second one in July, and we're planning one for the fall. And we polled 20,000 Canadians across the country in collaboration with Abacus Data, a polling firm, and made sure that there was regional distribution as well as age and other variables such as urban and rural Canadians. And perhaps if you're a public health official, one of the first pieces of information that we learned was that Canadians trust public health officials more than anybody else for information about COVID-19. This is great. Perhaps journalists might have some cause for concern, since we were ranked first for only 2% of Canadians. But overall, you would hope that Canadians were trusting public health officials, physicians, nurses, government officials, academics, and scientists. But what's curious is that despite the fact that journalists are not considered a credible or trustful source of information about COVID-19, the majority of Canadians were actually getting their information about COVID-19 from Canadian journalists, namely television newscasts and news channels. Also, interestingly enough, government online news sites were the 3rd most popular place to get news about COVID-19. And so in terms of the spread of information, some of it is coming directly from the government, and people are going directly to the source. I think for some of the things I'm going to be mentioning later on, I think it's very worthwhile to point out that social media sites were more popular than local newspapers as a source for COVID-19, as were word of mouth information from family and friends, which I personally found alarming. But perhaps the most notable bit of information that we gathered was that nearly half of all Canadians believed at one of 4 of the COVID-19 conspiracy theories and myths that we asked them about. That, to me, was probably the most alarming thing that we found out in May. I had certainly expected that there would be some bits of information and misinformation and pseudoscience taking root in Canadians, but I had not expected it to be so high. One of those 4 questions or 4 pieces of misinformation or pseudoscience that we asked about was whether Canadians believed that COVID-19 was a bioweapon that had been released and developed from a Chinese lab. And alarmingly, 1 out of 4 Canadians believed this complete piece of misinformation. And interestingly enough, and you'll see this trend throughout some of the other bits of misinformation that we polled Canadians about, which was that Atlantic Canada had a tendency to believe misinformation and pseudoscience less than other Canadians, perhaps reinforcing a stereotype of the Atlantic Canadians taking no BS. Also, interestingly enough, we found that quite generally, Canadians who were older, particularly 60 years old and older, had a tendency to not believe misinformation. Now, whether that's because age begets wisdom or because they are not accessing social media as much as their younger counterparts for news and information, we could not tell. I apologize, there's police going by right now. The second piece of misinformation that we asked Canadians about was whether they believed the 5G conspiracy, namely that instead of being caused by the coronavirus, that COVID-19 was actually a health effect of this new kind of technology. And again, 10% or 11%, 1 out of 10 Canadians believed this to be true. And again, you can see Atlantic Canada sees it as hogwash more than other Canadians, as do people 60 years old and over. The next thing we asked about was less a piece of active, not a conspiracy theory, but a piece of misinformation, namely the panacea that President Trump has claimed hydroxychloroquine to be. And so we asked whether hydroxychloroquine would be effective in treating COVID-19. And we found that 23% of Canadians thought this to be true. And at this point in May, there was absolutely no evidence that this was true except for some hype on YouTube and President Trump's frequent comments saying that it was a panacea. We also asked about sort of a pseudoscience belief that if you just rinsed your mouth with a saline solution and gargled with it, that this would be protective against COVID-19. And again, we found that 17% of Canadians believe this to be true. So we mixed and matched, clear conspiracy theories with pseudoscience and misinformation. And 1 out of 4 Canadians believed one of these 4 fallacies. I think the other thing that particularly for me was very alarming was that over half of Canadians that we surveyed were confident that they could easily distinguish conspiracy theories and misinformation from factual information online about COVID-19. As someone with a science background, as someone who spends a lot of time looking into conspiracy theories, I would not say that it is easy to distinguish conspiracy theories from truth all the time. So I found it very alarming, particularly in the context that Canadians were believing misinformation and conspiracy theories, that they thought that they had a inherent ability to see truth from falsity. And interestingly enough, also, nearly half of those who believed the bioweapon conspiracy theory and nearly 60% of respondents who believed the 5G conspiracy theory thought that they could easily distinguish misinformation online. We also found that individuals who believed the discredited theories spent more time on social media every day than those who did not. And this held true on all platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, and TikTok. And I give Facebook a little star here because we found that a majority of Canadians were spending most of their time on Facebook. It was the top social media platform that people were going to every day and where they were looking for information about COVID-19. And interestingly enough, that also held true for the younger people we polled, the 18 to 25-year-olds. Facebook often gets trashed by the younger generation as being mom book or for their grandparents. But interestingly enough, they were spending, that demographic was also spending time on Facebook seeking information about COVID-19. So that was the summary of information that we found when we tested Canadians or polled Canadians in May. And we asked the same questions in July when we did our second round of polling, and we asked some more. And effectively, we found that very little had changed in terms of what Canadians believed about those four pieces of misinformation and conspiracy theories, but we also asked several additional questions, and I thought they might be interesting to share. So we asked true or false, are young people less likely to be infected by COVID-19? And we found that 34% of Canadians thought this to be true. This is alarming for several reasons. First, it's patently false. All Canadians are just as likely to be infected by COVID-19. It's the age demographic is how likely you are to suffer severe consequences from having the virus. But in terms of being infected and thus being able to infect others, young people are just as likely as any other age group. And perhaps most alarmingly, we saw that in Quebec, there was the highest intake of this fallacy, which may be a contributing factor to Quebec's challenging and poor numbers for the COVID-19 pandemic. Certainly, I wouldn't claim that this is the only cause of that, but perhaps it's a contributing factor. And interestingly enough, we also found that young people themselves believed this more than the average of Canadians, which kind of makes one alarmed about possibly risky behaviors that they might be engaging in if they believe this to be true. We also found we also wanted to investigate the fake pieces of information and misinformation promoted by the pandemic. And so some of the next questions kind of refer to that. And we found that nearly a quarter, or actually 26% of Canadians, over a quarter of Canadians, believe that the flu vaccine contains coronaviruses, which is also patently untrue. We also found that about 12% of Canadians believe that mosquitoes and ticks are common carriers of the coronavirus. Also, we asked about colloidal silver and whether it has therapeutic value for people infected with COVID-19. This is not true. There is no evidence that colloidal silver has any therapeutic value whatsoever and could be harmful, yet 15% of Canadians believe this to be true. And I will round off this part of the data by giving you perhaps some good news, which was we also tested some true statements to see how well true facts about the coronavirus had penetrated Canadian society. And we did find that 85% or 86% of Canadians did understand that the main benefit of wearing a cloth mask is to protect others from being infected by you, as opposed to protecting you from being infected by others. Another part of our surveying surrounded the issue of a COVID-19 vaccine should one become available. And we asked the question, if a vaccine for COVID-19 becomes available, will you be vaccinated? Frankly, I was alarmed by these results. So 3/4 of Canadians said they would definitely or probably be vaccinated should a vaccine become available. But 1/4 of Canadians were not sure. They were either vaccine hesitant or they were against vaccination, not likely or definitely not going to get vaccinated. And in terms of vaccination politics, I find this alarming that even in a global pandemic such as COVID-19, we are seeing such high rates of vaccine hesitancy and anti-vaccine sentiments. In terms of a breakdown of age and gender, we found that men and women had approximately similar breakdowns of concerns or likelihood of being vaccinated, but that people who were 60 years and older were far more likely to be comfortable with the idea of a COVID-19 vaccination. Perhaps that's because they have lived experience with infectious disease and thus know the benefits, have experienced the benefits themselves of vaccines, or perhaps that might have something to do with the fact that they are, as a demographic, more at risk for severe COVID-19. In terms of whether vaccine hesitancy and anti-vaccine sentiments broke down by political view, we found that people who had voted for the Conservative Party or the Green Party were a little less likely to be interested in getting a COVID-19 vaccination than the general population. The People Party of Canada, as you can see, was quite an outlier on this question. We also asked the same question when we redid the polling in July and found very similar results. And I've pretty much, I'm coming close to the rounding off of the data from this poll, but I wanted to just show a couple of more slides. We also found that individuals were very much against, if you were against having a vaccine yourself, you were probably also against a mandatory vaccine. That's pretty logical progression. And we also found that people who were vaccine hesitant were more likely than the rest of the people that we polled to get their information from social media sites. So you may recall, I pointed out that about 23 or 24% of Canadians were using social media sites as a main source of information about COVID-19, whereas those who are vaccine hesitant were using social media sites a little bit more. You might argue it's in the noise, but they were looking at social media more than others. Interestingly enough, though, the top 3 sources of news information are the same, which speaks to a couple of recommendations or thoughts I have. So writ large, we found this bit of information about the demographic who believes misinformation and the other demographic, sometimes intersecting, that is hesitant or against a COVID-19 vaccination. Many are getting their news from television, that is from video reports, whether that's on TV or YouTube. They are also getting their information from government websites and from social media. I didn't get to show you the data, but we found that people who believed COVID-19 misinformation also said that they were very interested in health news reports. They were also very interested in stories that debunk misinformation. and that they are spending more time on social media than people who don't believe misinformation. So when you take all of that together, whether you are a journalist interested in tackling fake news and misinformation about COVID-19, or whether you're involved in public health, clearly visually compelling video stories and analysis that debunk conspiracy theories may be the way to get the truth out there. And also just a few final thoughts about trust. So there was and has been a lot of opinion pieces about changes in public health messaging and criticism about that. This particular opinion piece comes from the Globe and Mail, but similar complaints can be seen in media across Canada. And the first line, Dr. Tam has backtracked before on the risk posed to Canadians by COVID-19, on the usefulness of travel restrictions, and now on the efficacy of masks for asymptomatic individuals. If you know anything about science or public health, it's a bit frustrating to see this, because it shows a fundamental misunderstanding of how public health and research science works writ large, especially in an evolving situation. We want our public health officials to change the plan when new information comes out. That is a sign of a flexible, reactive, evidence-based public health system. That being said, the second part of this opinion piece, I think actually holds a grain of truth and something we should all take to heart. Effectively, the author says, and while we can't expect health authorities to be omniscient, we can expect them to be direct, to explain their work, to produce their evidence, and to offer some humility when they get things wrong. That can go a long way in establishing or repairing trust. Dr. Tam has some work to do. Okay. I think the advice is good. I think we need to be transparent, whether you're a journalist or a public health officer. You need to explain the evidence that you're using, the uncertainty, and the logic behind the decisions and advice. In other words, you really need to be explaining how the sausage gets made. If you're a journalist, if you're a public health person, that's both of us, need to set an example. We need to set a precedent. We need to model good behavior for the public as they assess the value of news information in an era of fake news. Why do I say that? You know, we as journalists used to have the final word, the only word, until the internet came. People would get their information from the nightly news. They would get their information from the newspaper. Now they can get it from anywhere. The same holds true for public health officers. And I think if we, as journalists and public health communicators, are not being transparent about how we are making decisions or how we're getting information or the processes that we are using to analyze that information, then, you know, how can we expect the public to do the same for conspiracy theories that fly around online, right? Why do we ask them to hold the conspiracy theorists to account and to explain their thought processes if we are not doing the same ourselves? And so I think we really, really need to explain how we analyze information, how we come to decisions, and hopefully by doing so, we model the behavior that we ask the public to do when they look at conspiracy theories and try and decide whether they're worth believing or not. And so I think that's where I'll leave it and pass on to Chris. Hmm. Chris, I don't know, are you unmuted?
I am. Pardon me. Can you hear me now? Yes? Good. Sorry. That was really interesting. And the data is rich and revealing. One thing I just wanted to kind of suture between Sarah's presentation and what I was going to say. One thing I was struck by was the figures on people's willingness to be vaccinated if a vaccine becomes available. And you expressed alarm at those data, which showed that about 25% of the Canadian population wouldn't commit themselves. About 10% would say no or likely not, and then there's about 17% who might be persuaded they're not sure. That means that 3/4 of Canadians are inclined to accept a vaccine, even though one has not been produced yet, and we're not assured of the safety of it since it doesn't exist yet. I find that very interesting, very compelling. And perhaps less alarming than you do, Sarah, because when I'm comparing it to the equivalent data from the United States that tells us that 50% of Americans are inclined to be opposed to accepting a vaccine. And that's a marked difference between the political sentiments, the sentiments in the States and in Canada. And so I think there may be something larger going on here which is one of the things that I wanted to address. I unfortunately
can I counter that?
Sure, yeah.
Absolutely agree that we can perhaps pat ourselves on the back, although I hesitate to do that sometimes. When we compare ourselves to our neighbors to the south, I guess my alarm comes from obviously we can't talk about the efficacy of a vaccine that doesn't exist, but in terms of getting herd immunity, right, which is ultimately what we need from a vaccine, from other vaccines, often you need 80 to 95% of vaccination levels in order to get herd immunity. And so when we think about the vaccine as this possible panacea for reopening, for returning to, whatever it was that we had before, whatever, I guess I'm looking at it from a more practical standpoint of actually, can we achieve that when we only have 75% who are, super keen to go out and get one right away. But yeah, your point is well taken. It could be much worse.
No, I agree entirely. But I think that we've got at least there's kind of basis for optimism here. If in the end only 10% of Canadians adamantly refuse to accept the vaccination, actually we'll have done exceptionally well. If we get 90% of the population vaccinated, that would be terrific. This is I'm sort of where I'm going with my comments. It does indeed kind of lead toward the differences between the United States and Canada as this is playing out at the moment. As Emmett mentioned, I wrote a discussion paper for the Public Policy Forum, which was published in June, on the topic of science disinformation in an age of pandemic. I'm not going to reiterate the contents of that paper here. What I thought I would do was to kind of step back and perhaps try to give you the sort of context in which we're operating now, the changed media environment that we have to confront in the efforts to educate the public and the mechanisms by which the public comes to know about the world that they now occupy. So, as Sarah made pointedly clear, the prevalence of what we might describe as information disorder or information malfeasance is a signature feature of the times that we find ourselves in, and it is now a salient political fact. And this has profound implications for not simply our efforts to combat COVID-19, but for democracy. Because democracy, as we all know, doesn't consist simply of the periodic exercise of the franchise at the ballot box. Democracy is rooted in the welter of public debate about where our priorities should lie and how we wish to be governed. So democracy is one great, ceaseless, noisy conversation. It's an ongoing argument. And without that argument, the vote alone is empty, it's illusory. You know, they had elections in the Soviet Union as well, but they didn't mean anything. So we therefore have, you know, cause to be genuinely concerned if the conversation of democracy is being undermined and manipulated by falsehood. If the public will is being informed by beliefs and contentions that aren't true. Because whether malinformation is deliberate, you know, on the part of malevolent actors, you know, the Russian troll factories, or whether it's inadvertent, just friends and family spreading unfounded rumors on Facebook groups. The effect of malinformation is to eat away at the to defend the public good, and in this case, the public health authorities. So in fact, the explicit goal of information malevolence is to undermine confidence in the very notion of neutrality and impartiality. And in large measure, that's the point of my paper on science disinformation. That disinformation targeted at science is a particularly malicious strain because it aims to erode trust in rationality, in the procedures of reason on which sound public policy should be based. So, at the risk of boring the heck out of all of you, if you can take just a few minutes to provide a little historical context for this. So, more than 500 years ago, Western Europe was transformed by an innovation in communication technology. It was the 2D printer. Johannes Gutenberg's invention of movable type was, for its day, it was the Google, iPad, Amazon, Facebook. It allowed the circulation of ideas and opinions to a vast dispersed public in a way that had been previously impossible. And in doing so, it set in motion the circumstances whereby the will of the public could become a decisive political factor. It brought the notion of public opinion into being, and along with it, the very first stirrings of democracy to emerge from the Middle Ages, in which the will of the people is going to form the basis of governance. So as soon as it became necessary to win the consent of the people, the masses, in order to achieve power, public opinion became an arena of contestation and manipulation. So by the mid-1700s, the early 1800s, newspapers, which were then the medium of public affairs by which people were informed about the world, newspapers became the voluble organs of political parties. And they tailored their reports of their accounts of the world accordingly. So the owners of these newspapers, not to say also the subscribers, would have greeted as absurd any suggestion that they should provide a neutral record of political affairs or even-handed coverage of their opponents. The very purpose of these journals was to whip up fervor in support of their causes and to denigrate their enemies. And they did so with a virulence that would have been almost unthinkable until recently. So this was an era in which freedom of expression in the service of political ends sanctioned almost any content. So over the course of the 1800s, that partisan press, that political press, gave way to newspapers whose revenue derived from advertising. So journalism got unhitched from patronage and a partisan agenda, and it got instead to mass markets. And the imperative became capturing widespread attention. So the result was that news content that amounted to a steady diet of crime and exaggeration and outrage. Newspapers of the day weren't beyond making things up, as long as it would capture the attention of an audience. So at the time, the name for that was sensationalism. Today we call it clickbait. By the second half of the 20th century, after the Second World War, the news media in North America were corporately controlled, but they were guided by an ethos of what they called social responsibility. So they were still, for the most part, profit-generating enterprises, the Chicago Tribune, the Toronto Star. But the excesses of the past gave way to coverage that was in the main dutiful and conscientious. So different media outlets still championed different political positions. Right? The Toronto Sun was a feisty blue-collar conservative paper. The Toronto Star was a liberal standard bearer. But the promise they made to their readers was that their reporting was trustworthy. They employed methods of inquiry and reportage and verification designed to guarantee that their accounts were actually true to what they described. In a word, they were objective. So democracy might be this great rolling, fractious, overheated argument about priorities, but it would be informed by a reliable running account of the facts of political life. The newspapers and news magazines and broadcast networks of the late 20th century were the portals through which the public perceived the world. And they set an agenda of common concern, instructing their audience should consider it. And they were able to do so because the public had no other choice. What citizens knew of current events beyond their immediate experience necessarily came to them through the mass media. So the news media not only fixed the terms of the real, they established the parameters of normalcy against which the deviant and the impermissible would be defined. So fringe or extreme views, so for example, the equivalent today would be the anti-vaccination movement. Extreme views seldom found expression in the news media, except as examples of what lay beyond the bounds of the tolerable. So although they purported to map the full range of social affairs, the news media in the late 20th century were nonetheless instruments of conformity. And in the late 20th century, the most prominent complaint about the news media was precisely their chokehold on public discourse. Corporate control, concentration of ownership supposedly restricted diversity of perspective. And so people on the left, those on the left, saw the media as elements of an ideological state apparatus, in the phrase of Louis Althusser, that they obscured the structural inequities of the society that they served. They were drum majors for consumer capitalism. They were celebrants of entrenched power structures. They were mechanisms of what the Marxists called false consciousness. So, for example, why did every newspaper in North America have a business section that catered to managers and owners and investors, but not a single North American newspaper had a labor section that chronicled the experience of workers or the plight of the unemployed? So that was the criticism of the left. On the right, conservatives, meanwhile, saw the news media as shot through with a liberal agenda, hostile to corporatism, suspicious of individualism, corrosively overemphasizing the abnormal and portraying the world and the nation and the community as one great canvas of catastrophes and social ills and divisions and jealousies. Then the 20th century came to a close, and along with it, the dominion of the traditional news media as custodians of the public conversation. So the 20th century media, sort of Gutenberg's children, were centralized agencies of public address that spoke to otherwise atomized audiences. The members of those audiences had very few opportunities to speak back to the media and next to no means to speak amongst themselves. The new portals of public consciousness are Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and the other social media, which, as we know, create no content themselves. The users create the content. What marks the era of social communication is precisely the ability of the public to talk to itself via these channels without the mediation of newsroom professionals. So constituencies of interest that were ignored by the 20th century media can coalesce. They can find expression. They can mobilize. And the content that percolates through these new social media portals issues from individuals, not from corporations, or far more from individuals than corporations. The news media are just one source of information among a myriad sources of information now. And their reports are reduced bulletins that are quoted and repeated and disputed and dismissed and mocked in the turbulence of the social media flow. And because content created by amateurs owes nothing to the truth discipline of socially responsible media organizations, it can retail falsity just as easily as it can propagate, endearing gifs of puppies at play or satirical memes of politicians. And so YouTube is filled with content that insists that the moon landings were faked, or that the earth is flat, or that vaccines cause autism. So what does the provision of information content look like under these circumstances? And probably more pointedly, what's it going to look like about 20 minutes into the future? And I suspect that in all likelihood, the future is going to resemble the past. In the years before corporatized newspapers and broadcast networks controlled the flow of public information and hemmed in the parameters of debate, we may be returning to a period of pamphleteering, albeit pamphleteering now powered by engines of artificial intelligence and delivered over social media platforms. This is a period in which what people come to believe is continually up for grabs. It's fought over at every turn. And what people believe differs from one constituency of the public to another. So, we've seen in Canada the emergence of online news and commentary sites that exist to proselytize, to advance a political position. So we have the Tyee and rabble.ca on the left, and sites like, actually just mentioned flatteringly in his departure speech, Andrew Scheer mentioned the post-millennial on the right. He encouraged conservatives to tune out the traditional mainstream media and to tune in media that reflected their values back to them. In the main, the Tyee, rabble, post-millennial, they may not be to your taste, but in the main, they're reasonably responsible. With the exception of Ezra Levant's rebel.com, Canada so far has escaped the sort of hysterical information extremism that's emerged in the United States with sites such as Breitbart and InfoWars and the Daily Caller and scores of others. Why that form of extremism hasn't taken hold in Canada is a fascinating question that deserves to be explored. Along with the question of, how long can this last? Whether it's, is this, a kind of indelible cultural feature of Canada, a genuine and persistent difference between us and the culture of the United States? Or, is it just a matter of time before the Canadian information ecosystem becomes, was balkanized and as hysterical as it has among our neighbors to the south? And that, therefore, Sarah, is why you know, I was particularly taken by that the data on the willingness to accept a COVID-19 vaccine. That it seems that still, relative to the political attitudes in the United States, that Canadians are they are willing to place their trust overwhelmingly in our public health authorities, to accept that the public health authorities are operating on with the public good as their utmost priority. Anyway, I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sarah and Chris. So we have one comment so far from Marcella, and I'll remind everyone that please put your questions in the chat. It's interesting to note, however, that in my opinion, you hear more from the 10% or the 25%. I suppose that's more newsworthy. It seems that the 75% are quieter.
Yeah, that's not only does the minority now have access to kind of public megaphones, they can address their fellow citizens in a way that they simply would not have been able to in, you know, as recently as 1998. But also we've still got the kind of reflexes of the traditional media, which is to look for controversy, that friction and, you know, the clash of political ideas and opinions that you know, generates heat and light and captures the attention of the traditional news media. So we do have a situation in which you know, even the responsible media through their own actions, they kind of inadvertently amplify the voices on the fringe or at the extreme.
Yeah, absolutely agree with Chris. I think the media the mainstream media writ large needs to take more responsibility for showing consensus, like what we've learned, for example, from climate change, that it's important to show consensus of the scientists, and that the 1% of extremist scientists who don't believe, for example, that climate change is a reality, that does not represent balance when we show both sides of that story. I think, interestingly enough, the tension is with the fact that we as the media rely on eyeballs. We rely on eyeballs to get advertising dollars. We rely on, if you're not reading us, then why should we exist? And I think, you know, there's that standard idea, you know, dog bites man is not a news story, man bites dog is a news story. And I think this is really the tension with that comment of Marcella's, which is, yeah, that 75% are quieter. Possibly they're less interesting to report on because they are the majority, and there's something about human nature that likes to hear about sort of things on the fringe. Which is not in any way an excuse that I'm giving to say that we should not be showing the majority, or that we should not be reporting on consensus. But that's more a comment on sort of human interest, and also the need of newspapers and other media organizations to get audience attention in order to have a self-sustaining business model.
I have a question. How would you, as professors of journalism and communication, evaluate the communication that governments across Canada have done on COVID?
You go ahead, Sarah.
I'll just start by saying, you know, it's a little bit one of the take-home messages I had, which is I think everybody needs to do a lot more transparency with how the sausage gets made. And if you look across Canada, Bonnie Henry has not only is BC doing relatively well, but she has a lot of public support, in part because she very much explains what we know, what we don't know, where we're going out on a limb, where we're making a guesstimation as opposed to something that's based on very clear evidence. And I think that that has served her and the people of BC well. So yeah, I advocate, oddly enough, a journalism professor advocating transparency, but I also think that, you know, the more we explain how the sausage gets made, the more we encourage audiences writ large to think about how the sausage gets made and think about where people are getting information, how they're coming up with conclusions, which hopefully they hold conspiracy theorists to account as well, right? We want them to be asking conspiracy theorists, hey, where'd you get that information? Why did you come to that conclusion? And perhaps if journalists and public health officials are explaining their thought processes, the public will start to expect those thought processes to be explained by anybody giving them information.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I would add only that as part of my research for the Public Policy Forum, I actually interviewed a number of public servants with roles of authority and responsibility in this area, in everything from Public Health Canada to to global affairs, to the the PMO, the Prime Minister's office. And I was struck by how enormous an undertaking this is, that they have to coordinate amongst themselves and liaise with international partners on best practices, what the hell happened in Italy, what's happening in Spain, and coordinate with their provincial counterparts in the provinces and territories right across the country, and at the regional and municipal level. It's a hell of an undertaking, and they did all this without this is in part how quickly the virus arrived, how quickly it made itself felt, but also the nature of Canada and the fact that the different the way in which responsibilities are divided between the provinces and the federal government. They did all this without a concerted national campaign of public education. Like, there was no massive the type of thing that you might have seen, during the Second World War or during the Cold War, even campaigns of public education around civil defense in the event of attack by the godless Russians. So ultimately, we'll probably have to wait for a study after the fact to look at the communication effort of the public health authorities, but certainly impressionistically, at the moment, I think they've done a really good job. They have, they have, to the best of their ability, managed public anxiety. They've informed the public. The rate of uptake of the COVID Alert app has been quite gratifying. So I think that the public service at all levels in Canada has done a very good job up until now.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask maybe one more question from David Kitchen. Fringe voices may be able to reach a wider audience than before, but I feel a major factor in the acceptance by the broader public of fringe and unfounded scientific positions is a lack of scientific literacy. Do you feel that people have lost their ability to think critically and understand scientific consensus to adequately separate science from snake oil? If so, how best can scientists explain their positions in a way that can be understood by a lay audience and perhaps more importantly resonates with the audience and resonates with them?
Oh my gosh, I have a lot to say on this. In fact, I'm writing a paper somewhat related to this. So when people talk, I agree. I think that there is a huge lack of scientific literacy in Canada, everywhere actually. And I think one of the problems is that when people talk about scientific literacy and how do we improve it, often they think about, oh, we need to explain what DNA is and the genomics revolution, or they think about kind of concrete aspects of science that they need to relay. I would take a step back from that and say, no, we don't need to worry about that at the moment. What the thing missing most right now in terms of scientific literacy is the notion that science itself is based in uncertainty, right? There is a constant evolution of scientific opinion and scientific thought. Like, the nature of science is to evolve and to change. And I kind of alluded to this when I was talking about the criticism against Theresa Tam for the changing of opinion on whether people should be wearing masks or not, right? There is an expectation from the public that science is this, you know, hammer that comes down with an answer and then it is there forever and ever, amen. Science is constantly evolving, and it is constantly uncertain. And part of the reason I think that this poor science literacy on this particular aspect exists is partly the fault of science journalists and journalists writ large, and science communicators and PR arms of research journals and research institutions. Give me 2 seconds and I'll explain why. Most of the information that gets relayed to the public through the media is what we call gee whiz science. You know, oh, look, there's this great study that has shown hammer comes down, this thing that is now a truth. And partly that's because journals and research organizations that have funded the scientists who are publishing in journals want to improve their brand. They want promotion for the cool science that they're doing. And it's not that I don't think we should be, as the media, reporting on this, or as organizations celebrating good science. It's that we really need to be less conclusive. We need to explain that everything is uncertain and, you know, show that, yes, when this really cool discovery happens, it is not a hammer coming down with an answer, chocolate causes cancer, but more, you know, an incremental step in a very uncertain process that is the beautiful thing that is scientific research. So I do agree with that point, but I think one of the aspects of scientific literacy that we really need to address is convincing the public that science is uncertain and that that's a thing to celebrate, and that it can be a very powerful thing for good, because it means that we're flexible and we can respond and change our ideas and our advice based on new data and new evidence.
Yeah, I'd only add to that well, first of all, I think the public has long been kind of estranged from science. The public doesn't really understand, you know, how science works. They have the complete misconceptions, as Sarah has described. You know, 25 years ago, public intellectuals like Carl Sagan were lamenting the dangers of a public that was distanced and estranged from science. Something that's new, though, and that I find very perplexing and worrying, is that apparently that disinvestment of trust in science, or an unwillingness to accept the findings of a scientific consensus, seems to be cleaving along political lines in a way in which it didn't in the past. It seems to owe itself in some measure to concern about climate change, where it looks like people in the center and on the left accept the scientific consensus on climate change, and some of those on the right, their response is essentially to dismiss the science. That you know, supposedly economic priorities outweigh the findings of climate change research. And so we saw that in one of the slides that Sarah showed right at the beginning, where on vaccine acceptance, seems to indicate, well, you saw the numbers of from the Maxime Bernier's People's Party. They were absolutely dismissive of science, and those who identify as conservatives were less inclined to accept a vaccine once it's available than others. That I think is that this really merits investigation. I don't know why this should be. That you should have, there should be right-wing scientists and left-wing scientists, or sort of just as there are in all sorts of other walks of life. So I'm not sure why this political division with regard to science is coming about, but it does seem to be real.
All right. Well, I'm cognizant of the time, and I will remind people that this has been recorded and will be posted on YouTube and shared on social media. Hopefully, we will be able to counter some of the false narratives, at least a little bit, with this. One of the silver linings of the pandemic is that it has forced IPAC as an organization to jump in with both feet into webinars and reach out to people who are not necessarily in Manitoba. So I appreciate you taking the time. It's been really enlightening, and I know everyone enjoyed it as much as I did.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for asking.
Yes, thank you very much.